Greetings and welcome to another lecture in neurodevelopmental disorders. We're continuing on here in this abnormal psychology slash psychopathology class to talk about various types of disorders of children. Here we're going to be covering the organic intellectual disability syndromes. Now this has a lot in common with those that are found in the prior video, the intellectual disability syndromes. But these are something that you can actually point at. You can point at something organic, something biological, and say, this is the problem. A lot of the other ones were more diffuse. There wasn't necessarily something you could point at. You might be able to point at a cause, but you couldn't point at something in the brain or in the body and go, and that's why. With these, you can. Starting with probably the best known of the organic intellectual disability syndromes, Down syndrome. It's more technically known as Trisomy 21 because it's caused by having 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of just 2. Normally, if a person has too many chromosomes, they don't last long enough to really be a person. Normally, that fertilized egg will die. But having 3 copies of chromosome 21 is survivable for the most part, but it is not without its own problems. Having 3 copies of chromosome 21 cause problems that are both physical and psychological. Physical problems can include some different formations of, a facial structure. Tongues very often are much larger. There's some more internal things that can be problem. We know that people with trisomy 21, or at least they appear to have a higher chance of Alzheimer's disease, early onset. There's also psychological limitations. Oftentimes, they don't score as high on intellectual achievement as others, or they may have problems understanding things. Now, some of these problems can be fixed, and that may cause increased longevity. However, there's a lot of things here that cannot be. I mean, if there's something like a heart ailment or something, that can be fixed. Okay, or if the child is having trouble talking because their tongue is too large, that could be fixed. Okay, and it may help the adult live longer. But it is also interesting that people with Down syndrome tend to age faster, or at least it seems that they age faster than people who don't have Down syndrome. Again, there's something about that 3rd copy of chromosome 21 that changes things. Now, what the deficits are, both physical and intellectual, depends on the child. Very much so. Like everything else, this is something that it can be a slight impairment, it can be a huge impairment. And it also depends on what ability you're looking at. The greatest problems tend to be in verbal and language-related areas. A lot of times, people with Down syndrome are not necessarily as verbal. It's not that they don't talk, but they may talk a lot less, have a much smaller vocabulary. Oftentimes, other things like the spatial abilities, ability to read maps, understand things in space, visual motor coordination, that could be just fine. That is not something that is being impaired here. But since, of course, as humans, we tend to value verbal communication above virtually everything else, that can actually make, individuals think that there's something very seriously wrong with this person, when in fact, most of them may be fine, and that's only a small facet. Now, risk factors. The traditional risk factor has been an aged mother, as they call it, which is essentially 35 or older. Women usually start declining in fertility somewhere around their mid to late 20s, and age 35 is really when it starts to kick in. Now, here is when, for instance, it's unclear whether or not those older eggs are simply more likely to have a problem with dividing the final division to let them be there from bar body and so forth, or if there's something else going on. But what also is a factor is a very young mother. If we're talking about women or girls really who give birth at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, Down syndrome is also a possibility there, because although that adolescent may be able to give birth, they're not physically mature, and neither is the reproductive apparatus. Older fathers can also be a problem in terms of Down syndrome. It's not just mothers that can have problems, particularly when because sperm are constantly being made. So anything, as I've mentioned before, anything that can alter how these sperm divide and so forth can definitely cause too many chromosomes in a particular sperm. which can wind up causing Down syndrome or other problems with number of chromosomes. Phenylketonuria. Yep. This is something that you actually may have noticed if you drink diet soda and you read the label. Because the most common sugar replacement in diet soda is aspartame or NutraSweet. And there's always has to be a label there saying that it contains phenylalanine, because that's what we're talking about here. People with phenylketonuria lack an enzyme that allows them to break down phenylalanine. Now, phenylalanine is an amino acid, and like many amino acids, it's broken down into its components before we use those amino acids to rebuild ourselves, essentially. But people who lack this enzyme, it can wind up with a buildup of this phenylalanine. It's not being broken down, it's not being processed, so it can build up. And this can cause problems pretty much from the start. In fact, from a very, very young age. And this is one of the things that newborn babies are commonly tested for, particularly if there's a history of this in the family. It's a very simple test to test whether or not they have the ability to digest phenylalanine. It can be tested through a urine test. It doesn't require blood or anything like that. And so what happens is if a child is diagnosed as having phenylketonuria, they simply will have to stick to a diet that does not include phenylalanine, that does not include that particular amino acid. And so this can really help. It won't necessarily, prevent problems entirely, but it can really make a big, big difference. And it's why they have to tell you if something phenylalanine like NutraSweet is in a food or a beverage. This is caused by one gene, like Huntington's disease, except in this case, it's recessive. So in this case, the individual has to inherit both copies of this recessive gene from each of their parents. So, it's much more likely to have it if one of the parents also has phenylketonuria. There doesn't have to be a family history, but there might be. But it's such a quick and easy and non-invasive test that it's pretty much done. It's done automatically, as we'll probably be seeing more and more tests being done. Because oftentimes when things are caught early, we can do more about them. Case in point, phenylketonuria. Another organic intellectual disability are the various cranial abnormalities. And again, this is exactly what it sounds like. Problems with the cranium, problems with the skull. Usually caused by problems with the brain that's encasing, the skull, the brain that's being encased by the skull. The first is macrocephaly. Macro means large or many. Cephaly means skull. This is an overly large head, an overly large skull. It's usually caused by an abnormal growth of what are called glia cells. Glia cells, if you remember way back from the brains chapter of your general psychology class, glia cells are basically helping cells in the central nervous system. They go through, they provide physical support, they clean up dead neurons, they travel, they do a lot of the housekeeping. They're the back of house staff. And glia do tend to divide, unlike many other brain cells, unlike the neurons that hold and send information. Well, if glia grow out of control, you could wind up with, for one, a brain tumor, and for another, macrocephaly. Wind up with so many glial cells that the skull has to enlarge in order to hold them all. And when this happens with children where babies, where the skull bones have not yet fused, or if it happens before birth when they really haven't fused and are often rather flexible, can wind up with a baby with a much larger than average skull. The opposite is microcephaly. Microcephaly is when the head circumference is more than 3 standard deviations below the mean. That's what SD is for, standard deviations, which means that this is smaller than 99-point-something% of baby skulls. And it's due to decreased brain growth. The skull basically grows to hold the brain, particularly before birth. And with less brain, you wind up with less skull. About half of the cases here are genetic. There is some sort of genetic abnormality that makes the brain grow less, or perhaps makes the brain grow more. The rest is oftentimes some sort of prenatal brain damage, and what's left over from that is postnatal brain damage, mostly for microcephaly. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things here that can go wrong. There's also what's called hydrocephaly. Hydrocephaly is when there is too much cerebrospinal fluid. In fact, hydrocephaly literally means water brain. And what is happening here is, normally, as I mentioned before, your brain is constantly both making and basically draining cerebrospinal fluid. What happens here is usually something is blocking the drain. And just like in your shower, when the drain gets blocked, the water backs up. Here the cerebrospinal fluid backs up. It can happen either before or after birth, and it can be treated with a shunt, a little tube that basically takes that excess cerebrospinal fluid, and it usually shunts it into the stomach or into the back of the throat where it is swallowed, and it is just processed like any other fluid. But this needs to be caught fast before it results in injury to the brain. Okay, this needs to be caught fast because, again, if the brain gets squished, whether it's by bone or whether it's by fluid or by anything else, the brain can be permanently damaged. Treatment outcomes and prevention. We're going to start with worst case, which is institutionalization. For those who have a severe or profound intellectual disability, very often, once their parents cannot take care of them, or if their parents cannot take care of them, this is where they go. Or those at an older age that are institutionalized due to delinquency. You have teens who are acting up or whatnot. They can wind up again being institutionalized. The big problem with this intellectual disability is that whether or not they are institutionalized, many do not get the appropriate training, the treatment that they need. Possibly they might get physical treatment if that is necessary, but what seems to make a very big difference in people's lives who have intellectual disabilities is training them to be able to perform needed skills, whether it's something as simple as learning how to take care of themselves physically, bathing, changing, learning how to cook, learning how to do household chores, learning how to do simple jobs, perhaps with supervision. So many people with intellectual disabilities can do more if they are given the proper training, if they are given the proper skills. I mean, quite frankly, that's true with pretty much all kids. If you take kids and you don't teach them the skills, they're going to have real problems. These kids just need more help, maybe a lot more help. In cases where the disability is relatively minor or mild, mainstreaming can help a lot. In that children are put in with average children, with non-disabled children in the same classrooms. Usually it requires a lot of planning. Oftentimes these students will need to have helpers to help them with the things they can't do yet for themselves. They may need a lot of care to make sure everything is going well, not only for the child with the disability, but also the other children and the teachers and the helpers and everything. Proper mainstreaming is not just dropping a kid into a classroom and saying best of luck. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of effort in order to properly mainstream kids. If you want to have a good outcome anyway. If you just want to get the kid out of your hands, then you can just drop him in. But otherwise, yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. Because by definition, children with intellectual disabilities cannot function without help, at least on the same level as children without. But oftentimes, given that help, they can do wonders. They can achieve more than anyone might have thought that they could. The problem, of course, is making sure that they get this help.